Hey guys, this is Pastor Frazier at Canton Baptist Temple. I hope you're doing well on this Wednesday. And today's Bible reading is found in Matthew chapter 20. And I draw your attention to verse 17, 18, and 19, where Jesus is talking to his disciples about how he's going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to be killed, he's going to be buried, and then he's going to rise again from the dead. I want to read those verses there. Verse 17, and Jesus going up to Jerusalem took the 12 disciples apart in the way and said unto them, Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock, and to scourge, and to crucify him, and the third day he shall rise again. What's interesting about these verses is that Jesus had already talked to his disciples a couple of previous times about his suffering that he would endure in Jerusalem, how he would be killed and how he would be buried and how he would rise again. And yet the disciples just didn't seem to get it. Sometimes I wonder if they just didn't want to see what was about to happen. In their minds, they were all focused on the kingdom. And the discussion that you have here, even after verse 19, is all about who is going to be great in the kingdom. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But look back, if you will, in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 21, because I want you to notice something. Two other times Jesus talked about what was about to happen in Jerusalem. But look, if you will, at Matthew 16, verse 21. From that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised again the third day. So if you remember from your Bible reading back in Matthew 16, he had already talked to his disciples about what was about to transpire in Jerusalem. Then look, if you will, at chapter 17, verse 22 and 23. And while they abode in Galilee, Jesus said unto them, The Son of Man shall be betrayed into the hands of men, and they shall kill him, and the third day he shall be raised again. And they were exceeding sorry. An interesting observation when you look at chapter 16 and chapter 17, where Jesus talks about what is about to happen in Jerusalem, he uses the word killed, that he would be killed. But he gets more specific here in Matthew chapter 20, and he uses the word crucify. He said, guys, we are about to head to Jerusalem. I am going to suffer there. I am going to be crucified. I'm going to be buried, and I'm going to arise from the dead. And that seemed to go into their ear and out the other ear. They were focused on the kingdom. They believed Jesus was the promised Messiah, and they were going to rule and reign with Jesus in the kingdom. So immediately after Jesus talks here about what is going to transpire in Jerusalem, you have in verse 20, you have Salome, which would have been the mother of Zebedee's children. Who were the children of Zebedee? Well, James and John. So she comes to Jesus and she says, hey, listen, when you establish your kingdom, I'd like my boys to sit one on the right and one on the left. And she talks about how she wants them to have a prominent position in the kingdom, the messianic kingdom that Jesus was going to establish. Well, you get down to verse 24 and you read these words, and when the 10 heard it, they were moved with indignation against the two brethren. They were all upset about James and John and them wanting to have that prominent position in the kingdom. You know what's interesting is if you look at Mark chapter 9, verse 33 and 34, you have this same story here. Mark chapter 9 and verse 33 says, And he came to Capernaum, and being in the house, he asked them, What was it that ye disputed among yourselves by the way? But they held their peace, for by the way they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. And so they were always arguing about who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And then you come to Mark chapter 10. Let's look at Mark chapter 10. In verse 35, and James and John, this is where you have that same parallel story. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come unto him, saying, Master, we would that thou shouldest do for us whatever we shall desire. Well, Jesus says, What do you desire? What do you want? Verse 37, grant unto us that we may sit, one on thy right hand and the other on thy left hand in thy glory. Now, you may read these two accounts and say, well, the Bible doesn't agree here, because in Matthew chapter 20 it says that their mother is the one that came and asked the question. And then in Mark chapter 10, it's James and John who are asking the question. Well, the answer is all of them were. There was James and John. Their mother was there. They were asking for special treatment, saying, we want to be great in the kingdom. So we want to sit on your right and we want to sit on your left. Now, what's interesting is Jesus had just talked about the suffering that he was about to endure in Jerusalem, his crucifixion, and yet they didn't seem to get it. They were so focused on the kingdom. And so Jesus begins to talk about, down in verse 24 to 28, how that we are not to be focused on the greatness, the way the world defines greatness, but he described greatness as being a servant. You find these words in verse 25. Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. By using that word Gentiles, he's talking about unbelievers. He said, lost people, they're all about trying to climb the social ladder. They're going to do whatever they can to become number one, to become greatest. But notice what he says in verse 26. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be great among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. Jesus said, I came as a servant, and I want you to be servants. Quit arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. Focus on serving others. What a great lesson about staying focused on our position, and that is to serve God with all of our heart and with all of our strength. Well, I hope this was a blessing and a challenge to you today. As always, I encourage you to hit the share button, and we'll see you again tomorrow for our next devotional thought.